All right. So I'm Joseph Lebrecq, and I have with me today Mark DuBois. Did I pronounce that right, Mark?
Well done, Joseph. Well
Great.
done.
Great. Because I know a lot of people go to a alternate pronunciation of your name often. Um, I try to remember stuff like that, having a sort of hard to pronounce name myself. So welcome. Would you like to introduce yourself a little bit? And then we can just kind of chat from there.
Oh, sure, Joseph. Thank you very much for having me this afternoon. I truly appreciate the opportunity to talk about this. Years ago, I was a professor. I was paid to ramble, so be careful what you ask for. But my goodness, I've been working with web technologies for, let's see, 27 years now. Yeah, 3 years after the web got started. So a fair amount of background information there. Um, Let's see, built my first commercial website for a multi-billion-dollar company in 1995. Started teaching with web technologies, teaching students. A couple years after that, created the first accredited degree in web systems in the world, and also created the first accredited certificate in rich internet applications. You remember those? Relying heavily on Flex and things like that. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
which I'm sure we'll talk about in just a bit. But I'm presently executive director of Web Professionals. We're the World Organization of Webmasters, and we've been around for, my goodness, 22 years now. We got started back in 1996 at an event in Lake Tahoe. Some of the key people that were there were from Macromedia. You remember them? From Adobe, from Google, well, I guess Alphabet now, and a number of other of the big tech players that aren't quite as big anymore. So we got some seed money from all of them, and we have been a not-for-profit organization. We focus on community first, education second, and then we also do certifications. The community and education parts we view as very strongly needed even to this day. There's so many people. I'm not going to point fingers or name names, but all the time I see, people saying, "Hey, CSS, I'm a JavaScript developer, and this CSS stuff is incredibly difficult and hard." And well, it's probably because you don't understand specificity and you don't understand the cascade and so forth and so on. And that's why we try and educate people through our School of Web. Okay, I've prattled on long enough. I'm sure we can talk about a number of things. One thing I do want to touch on is our web design competitions, design and development competitions. So we'll get to that in a bit. But back to you, Joseph. And for those listening, hello.
Yeah, so the stuff about CSS and people being like confounded by it, I've I've always had like a weird time trying to like get my head around that because I work in when it comes to web technologies, I work in HTML, I work in CSS, I work in JavaScript, among other things. And I always found CSS to be sort of one of the more understandable aspects of web development. It's like you've got rules that you set down. They have a specificity grade to them, right?
Yes, indeed.
And that can be easily calculated based on the rules that are set forth. And you're in charge. You write the rules.
Yeah,
But I've seen time
exactly
and time
it.
again people like saying that sort of thing, like they CSS is like just some mysterious thing they just can't understand. So it's I know it's a different way of looking at things. It's a different way of kind of having a logic tree, but even with that, it's always confounded me a little bit that people have such issues with it.
Yeah, it's not rocket science, and you basically, if you have inline CSS, you can do certain things, and you can override the external sheets. The one part of CSS that always confounds me, because I also do a lot of programming and teach programming, is to make something important, you put an exclamation point in front of it, which to me screams not important. it's that's of course they didn't ask me when they built it. And yes, if you're curious, when I started working with the web technologies, there was no CSS, there was no JavaScript. You could have any background color you wanted as long as it was gray.
Yeah.
In fact, the center tag didn't even exist when I got started.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when I first started when I first got access to the web as opposed to, what AEL presented you or what CompuServe presented you, where they had like their little interface that would come up and there were like different areas you could go to and do like very specific things. And I distinctly remember, and I can't remember what carrier I was with the time, but they made this big deal about, oh hey, we're gonna give you access to a web browser in a couple months, and you're gonna be able to type in URLs and like use hypertext and all this stuff. And of course, at the time, it was all. I mean, I distinctly remember like just everything being white background, black text, Times New Roman, with hyperlinks being blue. If they were visited already, they'd be purple.
Yep.
And that's kind of what you had to go with. They had some really crappy looking image files maybe here and there, but like design and imagery was not, it didn't seem to be a very high priority when this all started up, right?
That is true, yes. Yeah, you remember that the first browser was actually created at the University of Illinois. And I remember back in the days of Trumpet Windsock, oh my, I had hair when I was trying to figure out how to configure Windows to connect. That last mile was just crazy. I don't know, do you remember the Internet in a Box? That was actually available in like 1993 or something, because it was just so painful for people to try and connect. Some people actually came up with an Internet in a Box solution.
That like set something off in here, but I can't remember exactly what it was. But I'm sure I've used it because it's familiar. So, can you explain that a little more?
Yeah, so basically it was just, the technical term is PETA, pain in the, you can figure it out. And it was so incredibly difficult to connect, especially with Windows computers. We were back in the days of Windows 3.1.1 and so forth.
Yeah.
And you had to do all sorts of manual configuration. So people put together that Internet in a Box. It shipped on diskettes. You remember those? It's
Yes.
The save icon for those of you that are more modern at this point. That's the only thing that's remained is the save icon. But it shipped on, I think, 3 or 4 diskettes, and you installed all this stuff, crossed your fingers, sprinkled some chicken blood over feather ashes under a palm tree in the light of a full moon, and you were able to connect to the actual World Wide Web at that point, which at one point, believe it or not, there was less than 1,000 URLs that you could go to, and there was no search engine. So they also provided some basic information there, because up to that point, I either had to remember or write them down. And a number of sites even relied on just the IP address, even at that point. So yeah. If you look at where we're at today, we have come a long distance.
Yeah. And where are we today?
That's a good question, Joseph. We've only got an hour for this, right? Oh my, you poked the bear. What can I say? I'm amazed. What do they say? History never repeats itself, but it echoes. And I remember all of the browser wars of the mid 1990s, where certain browsers basically became the de facto standard, and they remained that way for years. Internet Explorer 6, just to name names. And it affected all sorts of things because so many corporations had that installed, and it stagnated for a number of years. There's a movement afoot today that says use multiple browsers, and I try very hard to. I'm coming to you today from Chrome, which is definitely browser that is used by the most. But I'd recommend at least trying websites and sites in other browsers as well. I think it makes a world of difference to have that diversity out there. Believe it or not, there's some things that even to this day, only Internet Explorer got right in terms of the HTML spec and how certain things displayed, like the end of a table. All the other browsers got it wrong, but we've moved on.
Well, yeah, I mean, talking about stuff like that, I mean, we wouldn't have the internet today as it is if it wasn't for Microsoft's efforts in terms of
Yeah,
Ajax and
that is true.
stuff like that. I mean, trying to, they get a lot of crap for their browser, and rightfully so. But yeah, I mean, sometimes things that show up as aberrations or unwanted accretions end up becoming the standard because, you know, just about everything loads in external data today without refreshing the page. And the origins for that, of course, come in through, stuff like Ajax, and previous to that, things that people were doing inside of Flash Player.
Oh, yes. XML HTTP request was a major milestone. It really was. And there is right now, there's a current issue, if you will. For the life of me, I scratch my head over this. And yeah, I was part of the HTML5 group, one of the subject matter experts that actually watched this stuff get developed. But the whole issue of Canvas, I
Yeah.
continue to scratch my head over Canvas because SVG, Scalable Vector Graphics, that does everything. Plus, SVG has a DOM, so you can style it. And Canvas, you have to take a picture, if you will, of what you've done, save that context, and then make whatever changes you need. And then, oh, God help you if you don't restore the context. And to this day, I scratch my head as to why Canvas is used so much, because SVG solved all those problems back in like 2001.
Well, I think Canvas is used so much because Canvas was Apple's baby.
Yeah, I just didn't want to say that, but
I'll say it.
certain companies push their technology, and it is what it is.
Yeah.
We see that over and over again.
Yeah.
So if I can digress for just a bit to touch a little bit on something that's near and dear to my heart.
Mm-hmm.
I mentioned history echoes, and sadly what we have seen over and over again is how these technologies are taught. I think it was around 1999, 2000, 2001, that time frame, a number of grants from the federal government went out, and many schools put programs together. Not trying to point fingers here, etc., but what we've seen is lots of schools develop their materials in terms of web and seem to have figured that it's similar to developing things like you would if you're going to teach, algebra or English, etc. And they've not updated their materials in nearly 2 decades. We've seen that time and again. I mean, yeah, the commutative property in algebra hasn't changed. If you were to teach from the 1930s, you could probably still teach those concepts. Milton hasn't written anything new as far as English goes, but my goodness, the web seems to change like a decade's worth of stuff every year. I sometimes teach a class on accessibility, and if I don't look at the materials for a year, I'm scratching my head wondering, have I been in a coma for a decade or something? Because things have changed that much in just a year's time.
Yeah.
There's Project Silver now. AG is the periodic table symbol for silver. And the reason that they're calling it Project Silver is because it's accessibility guidelines. They're moving way beyond just the web. There's so many things out there. So one of the things that we decided is, and this goes back a number of years, we need some way to convince teachers to upgrade, to make their materials more modern. We tried lots of different approaches, spent a lot of money at it, But the one thing that seems to have resonated the most is we put together web design and development competitions. We run these in conjunction with Skills USA. This year, we're doing it in Louisville next month. And that'll be our 16th year that we've done it. A lot of states do it, and you have to win at state level to make it to nationals. And then we give feedback and so forth. Anybody that wants to learn more, webdesigncontest.org is a good starting point for that. And the only way you can win is to practice what are industry best practices. You know, web standards, even though that term has morphed over the years a bit, that's the only way you can actually win at this competition. And oh, by the way, if you win at your state, you get to come to nationals. If you win at nationals, every other year, we go out and help with world skills. So this August, myself and a competitor that I'm training will be in Kazan, Russia for a fair amount of August as part of World Skills. And they have a web design and development competition there. So there'll be 54 countries, 54 or 56 represented, which, you know, if you think about it, that's pretty impressive. You can do something. If you do it well, you win state, you go on to nationals. If you do that well, you win nationals. And then you have the opportunity to deal with this old guy and actually go on internationally. Pretty impressive when you think about it.
And you said that that's been going on for 16 years?
Yeah, we started, well, let's see, 2003. I think we had a demonstration contest, and then we became official in 2004, if I remember right. And yeah, webdesigncontest.org. I think we have a list of all the winners out there going way back. You know, we try to do photos, happy snaps of everybody at the end. Adobe's graciously provided prizes over the years, and that's been most appreciative. So shout out to Adobe and many thanks for your help over the years.
Yeah. So I've shared webdesigncontest.org with the chat on YouTube.
Oh,
so that'll be preserved even in the archive.
Yeah, most appreciated.
Yeah.
And we have a whole blog section out there where they can look at judges' comments from previous years. One of the big issues that we have run into is a lot of the state competitions are having a tough time keeping up with us because at the national level, we now have our own network that we bring to the competition. We provide an API. We use Docker containers. So each has their own sandboxed environment that they can develop in. And then, you know, we've almost got it to the point where it's a science. And so we're trying to make that so it is repeatable and usable by others at the state level. We're still working on it, but we've got it now so it all fits in a box. And you know, I don't know. I don't think it's coined, but maybe web design contest in a box is something that we're looking at, which would help a lot of the state levels, because especially at the high school level, we do 2 competitions nationally and statewide. And those competitions are for secondary as well as post-secondary. And those are 2 separate competitions. And yes, we're also looking at moving into middle schools. But the trouble with the secondary competitions especially is, you know, teachers are asked to teach web technologies because it starts with a W. You think I'm making that up, but I'll leave the school out of it. Last year, I was at a high school in Missouri talking about web professionals and so forth to the group. And the person that invited me to his classroom where he teaches web design and development. To get there, I had to walk through his wood shop. Yeah, they both started with W, and he's teaching both things, woodworking as well as web design. So we're trying to help people out. That's the whole concept of making it very much plug and play, because it's not right now. And I think it's asking too much of a lot of, especially secondary faculty, to understand, you know, how you create an API, how you serve it up, what a JSON string is, and so forth, and then how to do something with it. Yet, if you're in the business, you bloody well better know how to handle that stuff. Fetch is your friend, right?
Yeah. So, how long have you been using Docker for kind of compartmentalizing the environments for this?
For the national competition, we started using that last year, and I think we scared the daylights out of a lot of people. But we've got it down to a science. There's obviously not me, but there are people on our team that are very good with this, and they've got it set up so basically you issue a command. Docker fires up all of the containers, populates them with Nginx servers. They've got FTP if they want to use it. They've got cloud storage. They've, all the things they need. And so we're building on that this year. In fact, they'll have their own instances of the open source VS Code. What's that called? Thea. That'll be running in their environment as well. And then at the end of the day, we issue another command, and that basically creates a zip archive of everything each team has done. And oh, by the way, we have about 50 to 52 individuals at the secondary level and about 20 to 26, somewhere in there, at the post-secondary level every year that are competing at the national level. And so once we're finished, once we have valid zip archives, we issue another command, and that wipes the slate clean, and we get ready for the next day, which is a different competition. So, like I said, we're getting it down to a science. And I want to give a shout out to James Anderton and the Burwood Group and Jeff McCullum, Jonathan Warrant, because without their help on this, we would not be nearly this far along with this competition.
Yeah, we started at my previous institution. We started looking at Docker for some of the applications that we had. And, it was sort of like a collaboration between my unit and IT, looking at what was possible and setting things up and testing things and, just kind of seeing how things might work out. And it was very promising. Yeah, we never actually put it into place, but
well,
it looked really good.
What is their icon has a whale in it or something like that?
Yep.
Yeah, and there's a lot of truth to that, because the more we work with it, the more amazed I am as to what you can do with Docker. Now, that being said, yes, we are also investigating Kubernetes as an alternative, because there seem to be some other things we can do there. But yeah, it's a fun competition. I always get a kick out of it every year, especially the high school students. They'll come in and they're looking around and, oh, I am hot stuff. I won first in state for my, for web design and development. I know it. And then they start looking around. Wait a minute. There's 50 other states here, and they all won first in their state. And, oh, you can just watch the bubble pop.
Yeah. Yeah. So something I wanted to bring up that you might have some ideas about or some opinions on. I don't know if you saw some of the stuff that happened around Adobe's AIR platform yesterday.
Yes, including your weblog post, which I reviewed, yes.
Yeah, so for people who don't know, Adobe AIR, which is it's a runtime environment that can be used to distribute applications across desktop and Android and iOS, and there have been other targets over the years. Things have slowed down quite a bit in terms of AIR over the past 2 years or so. And yesterday they announced that they were being not so much acquired, but there's some kind of legal agreement going on between Adobe and a subsidiary company of Samsung called Harman, which I knew them from Harman Kardon audio equipment. But apparently they're a much larger company than that, and they are a significantly sized company. And they've been partnering with Adobe to bring AIR and sort of flash runtimes technologies to a number of different things like cars and boats and refrigerators and things of that nature. So they've been doing that for, I believe, over 10 years now as a partner. And now they're taking on responsibility for the SDK and the feature set and support and all sorts of stuff moving forward with AIR 33 and beyond next month. And the primary catalyst for this is the Google Play Store requirement for applications being 64-bit, which currently, in the current production releases of AIR, that isn't supported. It's only 32-bit apps that you can produce. So next month, this new initiative is going to produce a 64-bit version of the AIR SDK for people to use to get their apps proper on Android. So that's really weird.
I think it's both good news and questionable news.
Hmm.
The good news part, and this is just from my perspective, is, and I think you mentioned this on your web post as well, your weblog post, but there should be much greater support, if you will, because an organization is taking it over, and I assume they're going to try to make money from it.
Mm-hmm.
Which that's good, because from a commercial perspective, I mean, let's pick on WordPress, because that I think everyone would understand. And you have a number of WordPress plugins that are free, and you have ones that you have to pay for.
Right.
Ones that are free often languish. They're not supported. Maybe the developer decides to do something else. The ones that you pay for, generally, those are kept up to date. They're current. And, like it or not, we are in the 64-bit world. Yeah, so that's good news that they're going to be doing that. But my question, and I do struggle with this because I am a teacher. I have been a teacher for many years, and I know a lot of teachers. Is this going to be still available as free for educational purposes? Can they use it? Can they use it to develop actual Android apps that would go out in the Google Play Store, as a case in point? Can they use it for, well, let's not forget there's another group out there as well. Lots of things are developed in Swift these days. You know who I'm talking about. And iOS devices, the App Store. If you're going to develop, you need to develop in both of them. So you have to teach this stuff. How do you teach it if you have to pay for it? Because believe me, and I'm sure you know this as well, most schools, whether they're universities, colleges, high schools, etc., they can't afford to buy this stuff, especially at potential costs that an enterprise would be spending on this. Of course, an enterprise is going to make a lot of money back. And from a teaching perspective, you're not. So again, I'm struggling with that part of it, just because how is this going to play out? Over the years, I've seen lots of technologies die for lack of support. And I've also seen, lots of things that become very monetized. It makes it very tough for students, because a lot of corporations, they'll look at what they've monetized and say, oh, yeah, we offer a 15-day trial or a 30-day trial. That's all you need, right? Oh, yeah, you're going to teach this stuff and you're going to cover it all in 30 days?
Yeah.
Probably not.
So my understanding of the way they're looking at things, and they haven't released anything formally yet, but it seems there will be sort of like a free-to-use tier with this new arrangement where, hobbyists and students and people who just want to learn and make something small, they're able to just use it, without having to pay anything. Which, this is weird. This always kind of happens when I'm in the middle of teaching on a specific technology. So I have a class right now going on that is, it's focused on AIR development for mobile devices, of course. Thankfully, we're approaching our last week here. Because that's always an interesting conversation to have. That write-up that you mentioned, the weblog write-up, that kind of breaks things down a little bit. Part of that is just me preparing for, okay, if one of the students approaches me about this, what does this mean? What is my thinking behind it? What is my response, right? And I've had to deal with this. I dealt with this last year with PhoneGap. and Apple pulled
Yeah.
the mobile application that's used to test PhoneGap apps. That was awesome. It was awesome. It's for iOS, it's for Android, and you'd be able to write PhoneGap applications and just, test them out on your phone using this app without having to go through a bunch of hoops. And Apple was just like, yeah, no. They're like, we're taking this down. So then I had to deal with at week 8 of a 10-week course. People are like, well, what do I do? So you have to have these things in order beforehand. And it is often a good lesson for students to learn that, yeah, this stuff doesn't stay still. This stuff's always changing. Like you mentioned, Mark, you have to stay on top of it. And sometimes when you're in the middle of a class, things will change quite a bit. Things are going to change when you get out of class. You think you know what you're doing right now, but a couple weeks from now, you don't know what's going to happen, So,
if I can interrupt a bit, Joseph, there's one thing that I always try to convey to students. And oh, by the way, that PhoneGap experience, we had a teacher that was teaching through our School of Web at that very time as well. And I happened to see the announcement and I posted it, and you could just hear the scream from Kansas all the way over here. And it's, no, you need to have a plan B. You really do. But, I've always told my students, and I firmly believe this, you need the ability in today's environment to be able to learn quickly. In the past, I've been a consultant, insultant, depending on your point of view. And, I'd have to make recommendations, multi-million-dollar recommendations, when I had less than a week to learn technologies. So you have to learn things quickly. But here's the thing that most people don't grasp. You also have to have the ability to recognize when something is out of date.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people miss that, especially a lot of teachers, because they're not building things on a daily or weekly basis. And so once you recognize it's out of date, you have to have the ability to unlearn, to forget what you know, and learn something new. And it's those last two parts that I think will differentiate a lot of people. Unfortunately, those are very tough skills to learn. And the examples that we've just talked about are just poster children for why it's so important to always have at least a plan B. Generally, I have a plan C and a plan D as well. And if you're curious, plan D is, oh, hold that thought, Joseph, I'll be right back. And eventually you'll figure out, oh, it's time to close it down.
Yeah. I mean, I've definitely gotten personally sort of tired of chasing things around when it comes to some of these technologies. I'm at the point where it's kind of like, all right, well, whatever.
The churn rate is just tremendous. If one thing that has changed with web design and development in the last, we'll say 2+ decades, is the rate of churn. It's just gone up tremendously. And in fact, we do certifications, professional level certifications. We do it a little different because we're a professional organization. We ask to see examples of your work. So if you want to pass our certification, sure, you can take the quiz, but let's look at some real examples you've done. But our developer certification, we don't dive deeply into any given technology, React, Vue, Ember, Marionette, Mustache. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. And what's the flavor of the week?
Yeah.
Okay. So instead, we focus on, do you understand the core? Vanilla JavaScript. Do you really understand what happens with ES6? What's going on with cores? What's that really imply? All those.
Oh my gosh. It's like the stuff of nightmares.
Yeah, it is. And that's why we added into our certification exams, because we have very evil-minded people that write some of the questions. Lots of good distractors with cores. Wink, wink, hint, hint. But, again, it gets back to things are changing so quickly. And if I were putting a program together today to teach technologies, especially web technologies, I would not spend more than a week on React or Angular or jQuery or whatever, because you get out in the workforce and you walk into an environment, it's, hey, we use Vue for everything. Okay, I have to learn it quickly. Most people, the jobs they work at today, they're going to work at them for what, 2, 3, 5 years, and then they'll move on. And the next place, oh, well, no, we don't use Vue. There's all sorts of problems with that. We use React, or fill in the blank. So again, you have to unlearn and relearn very quickly.
Yeah. I mean, thankfully, there's a lot of carryover
Oh,
between
yeah.
them all. Like if you look at like templating, so it's
Hmm.
like they all have some version of templating. So once you know one, it's fairly easy to make the connection between the others. But yeah, you wouldn't want to. It gets hard because like, what do you choose, right?
Yeah. Well, I guess the odd man out there would be jQuery, because theirs is kind of, it's older.
Yeah.
I view it as legacy now, but lots of people still teach that. And so that's a bit more difficult because you have to unlearn all sorts of things there in order to jump into React. Personally, I like React because it does just that. It reacts very quickly. You can develop things very quickly. If I can segue off of this a bit, um, I'd like to touch somewhat on an area that's also near and dear to my heart. Um, People call them soft skills, but I prefer the term essential skills. Things that in the past um, I learned from my parents. A lot of those things aren't being conveyed today. And that is an area that, showing up to work on time, being prepared for whatever you are going to be asked to do. When you make a promise, you stick with it. I could have chosen not to show up to this today. And some people do that. And yet,
That's
no, I
true. They
agree.
do.
I agree. I know you're already regretting it, but that being said, if you, so many people these days overpromise and underdeliver, and I think you need to do just the opposite. And that's one of the things we try to do, even in the limited bit where we do our web competitions. We actually do interviews with, honest to goodness, real people that conduct interviews. A couple of years back, we brought in someone that was responsible for CBS Interactive. You might have heard of them.
Hmm.
And, they hire, honest to goodness, web designers and developers. And they were doing the interviews of high school students in our competition. That was an eye-opening experience for many of the high school students. And, that most of them had never even experienced an interview. They didn't even know what to expect. And hopefully they learned a little bit in the process. But so many things that in the past were covered by others, they're just not covered there anymore.
Hmm.
And I don't know, it's got to be factored more into education.
Yeah. Not to throw formative instructors under the bus or anything, and it probably has more to do with parenting than
Mhm.
actual like teachers, right? But I think the formative years, that's where that's kind of lacking.
It seems to be. We spend so much time. Oh, where is it? I think it's Japan. And for those of you that are listening that are aware of this, maybe I've gotten it wrong because I've got middle-aged memory. So just fill in the proper country. But if you are in grade school or elementary school, etc., I think it's like up until the third year, you don't even take any tests.
Hmm.
You're not touching any subject matter. You learn how to interact with people, how to look people in the eye, how to say please and thank you, how
Yeah.
to properly introduce yourself, how to deal with problem children, even though you might be one yourself. I certainly was. Uh, you know, those things, I think we're spending too much time, I think, getting kids ready too quickly. Technology is not a panacea. They need to also understand how to get along with people. I'll give you an example. A couple of years back, when I was still tenured professor at our college, I happened to walk through the cafeteria and I saw an entire group of people, students that I knew, sitting at the table, a round table, and they're all working on their phones, just typing away furiously. And I just walked up to them, said hi and so forth, because it was the right thing to do. And because I like to poke the bear, I just asked, oh, why aren't you like communicating, talking to each other? And they looked up at me and said, Mark, we are. They're using their mobile device.
Yeah.
That's all well and good, but I've also seen individuals that you can tell they want to be part of a conversation. They don't know how to start. You know, they don't even know the base. You can see it in their eyes. They want to jump into the conversation, but they don't have a clue how to actually start. And I think those aspects are being lost. You know, if I'm new in a group or something like that, I'll probably come up with some silly statement, but within 5 or 10 minutes, we'll all be talking about various and sundry things. And you've probably seen this happen, Joseph, and I know you do it as well. But the art of conversation is a lost art anymore.
Yeah.
You know, simple questions. I mean, and I'm not putting you on the spot here, but, you know, things like, so, hi, Joseph, I'm Mark, and I'm curious what challenges you face when you put these things together, these interactive discussion sessions. I mean, that's a good way to open a conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, a lot of people don't even know how to do that.
Yeah, I barely know how to do that. That's what I start with. But yeah, I mean, there's definitely something lacking in terms of kind of just basic communication and just basic ways of going through life that I think is going to be hard for some of these people when they, you know, when they get to a certain point in their life, they're gonna realize, like, this is lacking. I didn't get this, and they're gonna feel ripped off too. They're gonna be pissed about it.
Most definitely.
So look out for that. So before we get too close to the hour, there are a couple questions in the chat.
I was just going to ask if there have been any questions fired in the chat, because I've been paying attention to you and haven't been looking at the chat at all.
Yeah, usually I've got a couple of screens here, so I got all the other junk over there. So there's mostly two questions. They're both from Thomas Benner.
Oh, hi, Thomas.
We both know.
Glad you could join us.
So his first one is about video on the web. Seems to be a bit more difficult now that Flash Player is gone. What can we expect for web video in the future?
Oh, my. Let's see. I know for Joseph, for you especially, but also for me, that's kind of like sticking the knife in after you've rubbed it in salt and then twisting it a few times, because you know what I'm going to say. I mean, Flash really, really did a fantastic job at this.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't. What we're going to see, in my opinion, is we're going to see multiple solutions for everything. Everybody's building a better mousetrap. You know, Google has the way they would prefer. Alphabet has the way they would prefer videos be rendered. Not everyone agrees with that. And so right now we're in a situation, if you do a video element, video tag, you have to include multiple sources. Yep. I don't see that changing anytime soon, which means to me that's counterproductive. You know, gosh, I have to put something together as we'll just say one format, because I don't want to get into the weeds of all the, you know, the technical stuff here, but we have to put things together for one format. As soon as I'm done with that, I pop over to Media Encoder because I have Creative Cloud account, and bada bing, bada boom, I create another format. And oh gosh, if only I could create a watch list or something so I wouldn't have to manually do this. But even that is causing a waste of resources, in my opinion. Yeah. Because we're having to do, I don't see that changing anytime soon. Yeah. The other big problem I see with that is the whole issue of accessibility, captioning, whether it's video, audio, and so forth. In the age of artificial intelligence, I don't see why we're not doing more of this. Machine learning can figure this stuff out. Well, you know, YouTube, their captions are reasonable until you get into technical fields, and then they become quite laughable often.
Yeah, they don't know how to...
I'm going back constantly, and no, that's not even close to what I said. Here, let me fix it. Long-winded answer, Thomas, but did that help a bit? So I see confusion for the foreseeable future is the short answer.
Yeah. And I spent probably the past 4 years or so on and off at my main position, just trying to kind of reform everything, because we were heavily invested in Flash Player and Adobe Media Server and everything. And that was all going really, really well until, until that all happened. And, we rebuilt like everything. We rebuilt everything so that it wasn't dependent on Flash Player. And, all we really got based on that were complaints from people like, why did you take this functionality away? This doesn't work as well anymore. This doesn't work on this device. And it's like, yeah, I mean, it's a different technology now. You guys wanted it to work just using, HTML5. Yeah. And this is how you do it. And you have to make some compromises based on that. It's a different technology stack.
And if I can build on that as well, just assume for a moment that I'm in management in whatever organization you're at. One of the first questions I'm going to ask you is, why in the bloody blankety blank are you spending all this time doing what you've already done?
Mm-hmm.
Why are you replowing the field? Do I not pay you to do something new? I mean, I'm being a bit pedantic here, but you get the idea.
Yep. Yep.
And really, from a shareholder perspective, that's a very good question to ask. And that's one of the problems I have with all the churn that's happening today.
That's the thing. You can't just spend your resources rewriting the same application over and over again every few years if the technology changes. It's ridiculous.
Yeah. Although there is some precedent for it because, and this is before my time, I know that's hard to believe, but back in the day when the movable type in Gutenberg was first, happening, there was actually a lot of this same sort of churn. The equal sign that we use these days,
mm-hmm.
that originated as people got tired of putting in the Latin equivalent of is equals to. And they finally figured out, okay, well, what could be more equal than two parallel lines? Yeah, except how long should the lines be? And if you look at really old manuscripts, I mean, things that are printed on the sheepskin and so forth,
mm-hmm.
some of the equal lines are really long because they wanted to make sure they understood it's a line. And now you look at your keyboard and you see that short little thing, but we've got the benefit of 500 years worth of hindsight. And we don't have that with web technologies.
Yeah.
I think this stuff has to shake out, and we're going to see this level of churn. I'm going to be on the other side of the grass before it's fixed, I think.
It moves so slow. I mean, it moves fast. It moves fast. Everything moves really fast, too fast, but the underlying foundation seems to move glacially.
It does. In fact,
you've got that contradiction going on there.
Tim Berners-Lee, he's come up with a new contract for the web. And yes, if you look, you'll see Web Professionals actually is a signatory. And we've included our logo. They've graciously included that and so forth. But, he's looking at this in terms of maybe it's time to just revisit this whole concept. And I don't know how that's going to play out. But, long term, I really think a lot of web technology is going to end up in library science. I'm looking at it from the big picture here. But really, what is the web other than a giant encyclopedia, which in this case has lots of erroneous information that needs to be culled?
Yep.
So I've digressed a bit, but you said there were some other questions, maybe from Thomas.
Yeah, there's one other one. This is also from Thomas, and it's about the future of Dreamweaver. Who do you consider Dreamweaver's target user base to be in the future?
I think Dreamweaver's target user base right now is high school students. There's lots and lots of places, schools that use Dreamweaver. Remember what I said earlier about the fact that programs were put together in 2001, 2003, that time frame? And Dreamweaver was a very good tool. Dreamweaver can be used. It has lots of nice capabilities. Mm-hmm. I even, recently updated the book that Kim Cavanaugh did on Dreamweaver.
Yeah.
So I've used it, and it is a useful tool, but I also think that it needs to be redone in some fashion. There needs to be something, and Adobe, you're not going to like what I say, but there needs to be a tool for the masses like they had with Muse. There needs to be something out there that people can use. Yes, I'm one of the few people that actually, I think, sometimes dreams in binary. And when I see an RGB color palette or hex colors, I can actually envision what they look like in my head, just with the hexadecimal values. Most people aren't that nuts. And because of that, there needs to be an easier to use tool that's out there. Right now, what's filling that gap, I think, is WordPress.
Hmm.
That's driving what, 32, 33% of the market share these days. The top 200 million websites are written in that. Because, if you understand how to use a tool like Microsoft Word, you too can put content into a weblog or whatever. And that's what a lot of people are relying on. But that's getting back to the whole idea of churn as well. Use the old classic editor, the tiny MCE editor that
Oh, yeah.
used with WordPress, and now use the new one. And in fact, I was actually working with a client yesterday, showing them all the new features and so forth, and they looked at me like I was daft, because all they want to do is update a web page. They don't want to. Well, what is this? Media and text. Why can't image? Why can't I just type it in?
Yeah.
I've digressed again. Thomas, did I sort of answer your question?
He's enthusiastically made comments around Muse and stuff like that. So I think he's on board with what you're saying.
I mean, right now, in my opinion, the premier editor and the one we are using, the open source version, I think it's I may be misremembering, but anyhow, VS Code. Lots of people use that. Lots of practicing professionals do, because it plays well. Those that are really into writing code, Dreamweaver has multiple cursors, and so does VS Code and so forth. So you can see the changes as you type. You can see all sorts of things. I would like to see Dreamweaver morph into something beyond just VS Code. And frankly, with all of the work that Adobe is doing with Sensei and the machine learning, I don't see why that couldn't be happening. I mean, I don't know that there's anything in the works, but it seems to me to make perfect sense.
Yeah. I mean, it does a really good job on a lot of the more intense kind of, graphical stuff, like, just being able to select subject in Photoshop. And, it does a much better job than I do manually selecting the subject in Photoshop, right? You would think that just dealing with text and code, it wouldn't be nearly as difficult.
I would certainly think so. I mean, I use Lightroom as well. And, I go through and I've categorized images in Lightroom by individuals. And honest to goodness, I have a whole section. I have 3 grandkids, okay? And I have one, there was a photo that showed up in Lightroom, and it was tagged as one of my grandkids, but it's my wife standing in front of our fireplace. And it's like, and then I got to looking closer, and we have a photo of said grandkid on the mantle, on the fireplace. And it actually was smart enough to recognize, it included my wife in a separate one, but that just blew my mind. When I looked at it, it's like, wow, I was thinking it was artificial stupidity, but no, it really is artificial intelligence. And I was impressed after that, just some of the things that it does.
Yeah.
And it's not just Lightroom. I mean, there's a lot of tools out there. A lot of, even AWS, some of their stuff, you can do things, very interesting things with machine learning. Have I sort of addressed Thomas's question?
I think so. He says thank you. So
okay.
Yeah.
Do we have other questions? Because I do want to be respectful of everyone's time. I know
it looks like
this would be an hour.
Yeah, it looks like that's it for questions. So I don't know if you have anything lingering that you might want to mention, or it is the hour. We could always just.
I do have one thing that I'll pass along, and this is another thing that's near and dear to my heart. And we've been doing this at Web Professional since I took over the organization, in 2016. But we ask our members, and we actually have on our front page, even for non-members, we ask them to sign a code of ethics, agree to a series. I've actually had speakers, international motivational speakers, get in touch with me and say, can we use you as an example, your organization, because we specific, it's things like don't overpromise and underdeliver. If you say you're going to do something, do it. I mean, all these ethical statements that we used to take for granted, I would encourage people to, the next time you hire a web expert, designer, developer, ask if they've signed a code of ethics and agreed to it. So I don't know if that's the right thing to leave on, but again, it's one of those things that's near and dear to my heart. So back to you, Joseph.
All right. Well, I think that's a good thing to kind of end with there. So, yeah, thanks everybody who joined live and everybody who's watching the archive afterwards. Thank you, Mark, for coming and participating in this. And see you later. All right, I'm going to stop the live stream. Thanks, everyone.